Hey y'all, I'm McDonald, your real estate agent here with Real Property Associates, and today's video I want to focus on earnest money. Now you might have watched a video that I did back in December on earnest money, and I'll go ahead and link it up down below here. The purpose of this video is to go in a little bit greater detail about what earnest money is and its role that it plays in the transaction, because I think it's really important to the contract and also to the conversation about contingencies and some of the other things that we're going to be discussing here in the next week or so. So without further ado, let's get into the definition of earnest money. And earnest money is simply your good faith deposit. Another way that I put it is it's your down payment to your down payment. It's money that you pay before closing, after you enter into a contract with a seller. Now, it's not extra money that you pay, so remember that it's not extra money, it's just money that you pay earlier. And this money is typically paid 2 to 3 days after your contract's accepted. So we call this mutual acceptance. So 2 to 3 days after mutual acceptance, your earnest money is going to be deposited, and it's going to be deposited with either the title and escrow company handling the transaction or one of the real estate firms associated with the transaction. And what they'll do is they'll hold on to that in a trust account until closing. And at that point it would be credited towards, if you're the buyer, it would be credited towards your down payment or closing costs, things like that. Now, the earnest money deposit can be either a check, it can be a wire, it could be a personal check, and it's typically 2 to 3% of the purchase price. It's typically what we're talking about. So the amount could be less and it could be more. Sometimes we see up to 5%, and that is the maximum for damages that can be taken in the contract. So typically we don't see more than that 5% number, but if we're talking about a $500,000 house, which we don't see a lot of those these days, but $500,000 house, we're talking about, you know, $10,000 to $15,000 of earnest money. And if we're talking about $1 million house, we're going to be talking more like $20,000 to $30,000 of earnest money. But this earnest money is extremely important to the transaction, and essentially it just shows to the seller as the buyer that you are serious about purchasing this house. Now, the amount of earnest money you put can be a strong negotiation tool for you, and could, if all things are equal, separate your offer from another offer. But really what it's doing is it's showing your commitment to the transaction. And so sellers like to see a larger earnest money amount there because they know that you will do more and try harder to make sure that this deal stays together. For the seller, there's risk, right? You take your house off the market when you accept an offer, you're not accepting other offers, you're not marketing it anymore. And so for the seller, there's inherent risks in taking their house off the market. And so this earnest money is a way to protect their interests in the transaction. If you as the buyer were to default for some reason on the contract, the seller would be, in theory, entitled to your earnest money deposit as the damages. And typically in the contract, there's verbiage that stipulates that's what happens, that the most amount of damages that can be taken is just that earnest money amount. Now, earnest money, and we talking about losing your earnest money. Nobody wants to hear about that. And so what we do is we include contingencies in the contract. And those are essentially buts in the contract, alternatives in the contract. If for some reason you weren't able to obtain financing, if you have a financing contingency, your financing contingency would protect you and your earnest money and allow you to get your earnest money back if something happened with your financing. Maybe the appraisal came in low. I talked about that in a different video here, and I'll talk about more contingencies here going forward. But the big idea is that these contingencies protect your earnest money in the event that you default on the contract. Now, if you default on the contract and are not protected in that way, so maybe you just decide you don't want to buy the house anymore. We get down to the last minute and you decide, you know what, I don't want to buy this house anymore. Then the seller would, in theory, be entitled to your earnest money. If you are a buyer in Seattle, and this is pretty common right now, and you waive all your contingencies or you have very few contingencies, then what that means is that you just have less protection. Your earnest money is more vulnerable. And when buyers ask me, what's the risk of waiving my financing contingency or waiving my inspection contingency? Well, I would say, the risk with waiving your inspection contingency is going to be a little more than just your earnest money, right? Because you don't know what you're getting yourself into in the house. You don't get to see, you don't get an inspection, so you're potentially going to have issues with the house that come up later on. Whereas with a financing contingency, maybe you're just not able to purchase the house anymore, and it would just be limited to your earnest money as your damages. So the big idea here is that earnest money is your good faith deposit. It is going to be collateral in the transaction, and it is held by a neutral third party until closing, and at that point it's going to be credited towards the buyer's down payment. I hope this video is helpful for you. Again, like I said, this is a little bit more in depth than the previous video that I did, and I think this is going to be helpful to have this understanding as we continue to talk about what contingencies are and just the other parts of a real estate contract in general. So thanks for watching, and we will talk here soon. Bye for now.